In the South Pacific in 1943, the sea looked like a sheet of deep blue satin pressed smooth, yet beneath that calm it hid lethal whirlpools. The air carried a sour mix of salt and fuel. After 3 straight days running submerged, the submarine Arrowfish had little choice. Her batteries were sagging toward the line where caution turned into danger, and the boat needed air to breathe and power to fight. The roar of the diesel engines rose as the captain ordered the boat up, then gradually faded as the conning tower finally broke the surface. Metal scraped against seawater with a dull, heavy sound that cracked the ocean's silence. A surfacing was never casual. It was a checklist written in sweat and loss. Valves confirmed, hull integrity watched, stations manned, eyes out, voices low. On a surface submarine, a single mistake could be heard, seen, and punished. All hands, stand by. Execute the surfacing and charging procedure. Lookouts, take your stations. Eyes on air and sea at all times. Captain Kirkpatrick's voice carried through the internal comms into every compartment. He did not need to shout. His steadiness did the work. 10 years in the Navy had carved deep lines into his face with wind and smoke, and his gaze held the sharp patience of a man who measured risk by the second. Under his direction, the crew moved as if pulled by the same rope. The deck hatch was shoved open. Fresh air, salted and damp, poured down into the boat and clashed with the stale, oily atmosphere below. Men who had lived for days inside a steel tube drew in a few greedy breaths before duty pulled them back into their roles. Kirkpatrick knew the temptation of the surface, light, air, the illusion of safety. He also knew it was a trap. Out here, the ocean was wide enough to hide a killer. When the charging equipment began to run, it sent a low humming vibration through the hull. The diesels took their load, and the boat became, for a time, a floating power station. The lookout's job became the crew's lifeline. Binoculars swept the horizon in slow arcs. The gun mount stayed covered. No one moved faster than necessary. Every clank of metal was controlled. Then the lookout's arm snapped up in signal, sharp and urgent. Captain, contact off the left bow. Man in the water, looks like an Allied pilot. Kirkpatrick climbed to the conning tower and raised his binoculars. Far out on the swells, an orange life raft rose and fell like a dropped leaf. A figure lay across it, weakly lifting an arm and letting it fall again, as if even waving cost too much. Kirkpatrick's mind ran the same calculation it always did: risk, duty, value, time. He did not like lingering on the surface, but procedure was clear, and the sight of a fellow serviceman in the ocean carried its own weight. Launch the small boat. Rescue detail. Move. Keep it tight and quiet. He added the last part for a reason. A rescue could become a distraction. Distraction could become noise. Noise could become a flare in the enemy's eyes. The dinghy was lowered quickly. 2 sailors bent to the oars and drove it toward the raft, keeping their strokes even to avoid splashing. The deck crew watched both the sea and the sky, counting the minutes. 20 minutes later, they hauled the pilot onto the deck, his flight suit soaked through, his lips purple from cold. His eyes were half-lidded, unfocused, but he tried to speak. A corpsman pushed in and took over, checking pulse and breathing, stripping away wet layers, wrapping the man, rubbing warmth back into his hands. Someone brought a mug and held it near his mouth. Someone else stood by with a blanket, ready to cover him the moment the corpsman nodded. For a moment, the deck became a tight knot of controlled motion. Kirkpatrick stood nearby, tracking the corpsman's work, but he kept lifting his eyes to sweep the horizon. War had taught him that mercy did not cancel danger. If anything, it invited it. The ocean did not care about intent, and neither did the enemy. A faint irregular fluttering drew everyone's attention. Heads turned. A juvenile albatross stumbled onto the edge of the deck as if it had fallen out of the sky and forgotten how to land. Its wings sagged. Black oil smeared its feathers so thickly that the bird's natural white was nearly unrecognizable. It trembled, and its head bobbed weakly, as if the effort of holding itself upright was already more than it could afford. The unexpected visitor silenced the deck in a way gunfire never could. Men who had been busy a second before now stared at the small life in front of them, surprised and unwilling to look away. The bird was not an enemy. It was not a weapon. It was only alive, and not for long. "Captain, that thing is too dangerous." Executive Officer Harris broke the stillness. He stepped to Kirkpatrick, urgency in his voice. "Look at its feathers. If we bring it inside, it could clog ventilation ducts. And who knows if it's going to start squawking. We're surfaced and exposed. Any unusual noise could draw the enemy. By procedure, unknown debris at sea gets cleared immediately. Toss it overboard." Harris did not say this to be cruel. He said it because submarines were unforgiving machines. A clogged duct could mean heat and fumes. A sudden shriek could carry farther than a man wanted to believe. A moment's delay could be the difference between submerging cleanly and being caught. Harris had a duty that could be expressed in one sentence: keep the boat alive. Kirkpatrick did not answer right away. He walked to the deck edge, crouched, and studied the bird. It seemed to sense his presence, shrinking back faintly, but it lacked the strength even to lift its head. Beneath the oil-matted feathers, its thin body rose and fell rapidly, each breath a struggle. It was not a threat in the usual sense. It was a test of what war allowed a man to be. Kirkpatrick's eyes moved across his crew. He saw pity in the faces of young sailors. He saw the older machinist, Graham, frown slightly, weighing the risk. He saw the corpsman set down his medical bag and glance over, as if part of him had been pulled away from the pilot by the bird's slow, terrible breathing. These men lived among steel and smoke and the constant arithmetic of life and death. They had watched comrades disappear without ceremony, yet in front of this weak, trembling creature, something softer surfaced in them. On one side stood iron rules that protected dozens of lives. On the other stood a dying animal and the crew's unmistakable reluctance to discard it. Kirkpatrick's fingers tapped the railing, unconsciously counting costs. He knew Harris's choice was the safest and most faithful to procedure. Remove the bird, and the risk vanished. No clogged ducts, no unexpected noise, no time lost. But each time he looked at the albatross's labored breathing, a quiet resistance rose in him. The surface, for all its danger, also revealed things the deep did not: color, wind, life. The war already demanded a hard heart. It did not need to take everything else, too. After a brief silence, Kirkpatrick stood. His gaze hardened again, but there was a trace of gentleness beneath it. "Harris, I understand your concerns. Procedure matters." He let that land first, easing the tension in his officer's face. "But this is a life. We don't throw it away without trying." He paused, then gave his decision with boundaries built into every line. "Put it in the canvas cover of Life Raft 2. That's relatively enclosed and won't affect internal ventilation. Assign a watch rotation to care for it. Use only leftover fresh water from after duty to wipe the oil off its feathers. Feed it only the smallest fish from the bait bucket. No one touches crew rations." He turned to the men on deck and raised his voice so the limits were unmistakable. "It gets 36 hours. That's the time we need to finish charging. After 36 hours, whether it can fly or not, it goes free. Until then, nobody takes it below. Nobody lets its care interfere with watch or duty. If anything unusual happens, report immediately, and I will end this arrangement at once." It was a compromise that held the safety line without openly breaking it, while leaving the bird a narrow chance. Harris opened his mouth as if to argue, then met the captain's unwavering eyes. At last he nodded. "Understood, Captain. I'll assign the men and see it done." A few sailors moved at once, lifting the Albatross carefully and placing it into Life Raft 2. They pulled the canvas cover over it, leaving a narrow opening, enough to block wind without trapping air. The raft was on the deck, not in the boat. The bird would stay outside, as close to freedom as it was to death. A young sailor stepped forward. "Captain, I'll take care of it. I can do it between watches." Kirkpatrick studied him for a beat, reading his eagerness and his youth. "Name?" "Tommy, sir." Kirkpatrick nodded. "All right, Tommy. Keep your hands clean, your movements quiet, and your priorities straight. Report anything. If you have doubts, you tell Harris, and Harris tells me." Sunlight broke through the clouds and fell across the deck, touching the small shape inside the raft and softening the crew's faces for the first time in hours. The charging equipment continued its low hum. The lookout remained locked on the horizon. The war shadow never left them. But because of an oil-soaked Albatross and a captain's controlled mercy, the deck of the Arrowfish carried a warmth that did not belong in a battlefield. Tommy had been in the Navy only 6 months, and some boyishness still clung to his face. He found a clean old rag, dampened it with the remaining fresh water from his shift, and knelt beside Life Raft 2. With careful, gentle strokes, he began to wipe away the oil. He did it the way he had been trained to do everything on a submarine, slowly enough to be safe, quickly enough to matter. "Little guy," he murmured, so softly it was almost a private thought. "If you made it here, you can make it through. We'll call you Breeze. I want you flying again." Breeze seemed to understand something in the tone. It stopped curling in on itself and lifted its head slightly. Dark eyes watched Tommy, and the first pure fear eased into a wary calm. Tommy moved with the caution of someone handling glass. Slowly he loosened the hardened patches of oil and pulled them free. Underneath, small flecks of white down appeared again. Through the slit in the canvas, sunlight fell across Breeze's thin body and across Tommy's focused face, creating a scene of quiet tenderness that felt out of place and yet entirely necessary. Word spread quickly. Whenever a man had a moment between watches, he would drift to the deck and look into Life Raft 2. Some offered advice, some offered nothing but presence. Graham, the older machinist, produced a small comb from his personal kit and began to straighten the feathers Tommy had cleaned. "You're like us," Graham muttered as he worked, half to himself, "stuck in a steel shell, dreaming about open air. The way you keep trying to stretch those wings looks like us after a patrol, praying we'll see land again." The comment struck something in the men around him. They lived for weeks inside a cramped, sealed submarine, cut off from daylight. Surfacing to charge was the only time they felt sun and wind. The boat was a moving iron prison, and they were its prisoners, except their captivity came with duty, fear, and the weight of protecting home. Breeze's struggle mirrored their own. Pity began to turn into attachment, a place to rest emotions they never spoke aloud, because speech itself could be dangerous. Peter, the sonar man, worked below in the listening compartment, yet every time he was relieved, he came up to the deck first to check Breeze. From his station, he could sometimes hear the bird's faint tapping as it pecked at the canvas. At first, he worried the sound might interfere with his work. Then he realized it did not. In a strange way, it became a friendly background noise, a thin counterweight to the pressure that kept his nerves tight. Underwater, sonar demanded constant strain, sorting layers of ocean sound, separating harmless noise from the hint of an enemy screw. That quiet pecking gave him a momentary ease. "Captain Breeze is doing better," Tommy reported each day. He couldn't hide the relief in his voice. "It's eating the little fish on its own now." Kirkpatrick listened carefully each time. Occasionally he came onto the deck and looked toward Life Raft 2 from a distance. He did not crowd the bird. He did not make a show of it. Yet the sight of Breeze sitting upright, feathers slowly brightening, did something to him that he refused to name. In the open air he felt too exposed. In the open air he also felt, for a moment, like a man instead of a command function. Not everyone relaxed. Harris's concern never fully left him. He gave Kirkpatrick precise updates on charging progress and did not miss the chance to remind him of the deadline. "Captain, charging is halfway complete. 18 hours to the limit." "Captain, 10 hours remaining. We should be ready to release the bird and prepare to dive." His reminders were not cruelty. They were discipline. The war remained close. During the surfacing period, the lookout had twice spotted aircraft silhouettes at distance. Both times they were confirmed as Allied reconnaissance planes, but the moments tightened every throat. You did not know a plane's allegiance until you knew, and by then it could be too late. On one of his reports, Harris finally pressed the point again. "Captain, we cannot let one bird affect the deployment. Procedure is procedure. The 36-hour limit must be strict. If it still can't fly, we abandon it. That's the responsibility we owe to the crew." Kirkpatrick nodded. He understood Harris's duty and agreed with him. "I know," he said evenly. "The deadline stands. I will personally supervise the release preparations." He also knew he had already stepped to the edge of standard wartime practice. He could not let a moment of warmth put the boat at risk. The ocean was not sentimental. Neither were destroyers. As the 36-hour mark approached, the mood on deck turned heavy. Men still came to see Breeze between watches, but their smiles faded into worry. Tommy spent nearly every spare minute tending the bird, feeding it, changing the water, finding soft strips of cloth to line the raft so Breeze could rest. He wiped at the last stubborn streaks of oil and watched day after day for the moment when wings would hold firm. Yet the body did not obey the heart. Breeze's wings still lacked full strength. It could stand, and it could shuffle and peck, but whenever it tried to spread its wings, they drooped again with exhaustion. Each attempt felt like a question the bird could not answer. "Tommy," Graham said gently, putting a hand on his shoulder, "don't tear yourself apart. We've done what we can." Tommy didn't answer. He only crouched beside the raft and stroked Breeze's head. The bird leaned into his fingers and gave a thin, weak call. The sound was small, but it pricked every man on the deck like a needle. It was not loud enough to bring an enemy. It was loud enough to bring regret. Harris had already assigned hands for the release. The plan was simple and careful. Open the canvas, lift the bird to the deck edge, let it go without drama, then clear the deck and dive. No debate, no delay. He stood beside Kirkpatrick as the final minutes closed and spoke with restrained firmness. "Captain, time is nearly up. We execute the plan." Kirkpatrick glanced at his watch. The second hand seemed louder than the charging equipment. He looked at the men's faces, at Tommy's reddened eyes, at Graham's tight mouth, at the way even hardened sailors avoided looking directly at the raft as if they might be implicated in what was coming. Then he looked at Breeze. The bird watched them with clear eyes, quiet and present as if it had learned the boat's rules. Be still, be small, survive. Again the captain felt the conflict, the safety of dozens and the iron rules that protected them against a life that had somehow become connected to this crew. If they released Breeze now, in its current condition, the ocean would take it. If they broke the limit, even slightly, they invited risks the sea and the enemy were always eager to punish. The cruelty of war was not only in gunfire and explosions. It lived in this kind of choice, where both answers tasted like loss. The deck fell into silence. Only wind and the low hum of equipment remained. Every eye turned to Kirkpatrick, waiting. His hand rose, fingers beginning to form the release order. He felt the thinness of the surface air against his skin, too open, too bright. He could almost imagine a distant periscope of an aircraft, a glinting lens on the horizon, turning toward them. He could also feel the weight of his crew's eyes, not pleading, not defiant, only tired and human. Then hurried footsteps thundered up from below. Peter burst onto the deck, his face drained of color. He barely had time to breathe before he shouted, "Captain, emergency! Port side long-range contact! Suspicious mechanical noise, unknown type, closing on us!" The words hit like a stone thrown into still water. The crew's sorrow and hesitation vanished in an instant, replaced by pure alertness. Kirkpatrick's raised hand dropped. His eyes sharpened as if a switch had been thrown. "Report," he snapped. "Noise signature range. Speed." "Yes, Captain." Peter forced his breath under control and spoke fast. "Low frequency with a rhythmic vibration. Initial assessment, propeller noise from a vessel. Range about 10 nautical miles. Speed slow. Bearing uncertain. I can't confirm whether it's Allied or Japanese. 10 miles. Close enough to be real, far enough to be a knife you could not yet see. A surfaced submarine had no armor. The boat's safety depended on time, silence, and discipline. "Harris, issue the order now," Kirkpatrick said, voice steady and forceful. "Suspend all release preparations. Full silent running, shut down non-essential equipment, reduce our noise signature, lookouts, widen the scan and stay sharp. Sonar continuous tracking, any change gets reported immediately." "Understood," Harris replied, and moved at once to relay the orders. The crew executed without hesitation. The charging equipment was shut down, and the diesels were brought under strict control. Men on deck held their breath, careful not to let even a careless clank carry. A dropped tool could sound like a bell out here. A shouted word could travel farther than anyone wanted to admit. Wind swept the deck with salty cold and the kind of quiet that made a man hear his own blood. Kirkpatrick stood near the conning tower, scanning the horizon. He felt his hands clench and relax as his mind measured routes down, angles, depths, and the time needed to seal the boat. He did not allow himself to think about breeze. He did not allow himself to think about the pilot, who still lay wrapped and shivering below. He allowed himself only the question that mattered: what is coming? Below, Peter continued to track and report through internal comms. "Captain, contact is still closing. Range now 8 nautical miles. Speed remains slow. No additional signals detected. Keep tracking. Do not miss anything," Kirkpatrick answered. Minutes dragged. In the silence, each one felt like an hour. Men waited for the sonar's verdict with nerves stretched tight. Tommy stood at his station, hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the shock of switching from farewell to survival. In the same breath, he feared for the boat and for the fragile life in Life Raft 2, as if the two worries had become tied together without his consent. About 30 minutes later, Peter's voice came again, uncertain this time. "Captain, the signature is changing, the rhythm is breaking up, frequency is irregular, the sonar pattern suggests more than one source. It sounds like a group of objects moving through the water." "A group?" Kirkpatrick frowned. War made every unfamiliar sound into a threat. He imagined multiple screws, a screen line of ships, a coordinated search. His jaw tightened. "Expand the listen, track it, identify it," he ordered. 20 minutes later, Peter spoke again, and the tension in his voice was gone. "Captain, confirmed, it's a pod of whales. Their movement created the noise. They're moving slowly away from our area. Whales." The deck exhaled as one body, fear drained out and left behind the strange light weakness of relief. Some men laughed once, quietly, and then caught themselves, ashamed of the sound. On a submarine, relief was allowed, but only in a disciplined dose. Harris stepped to Kirkpatrick and let out a breath he'd been holding. "Captain, false alarm. Whales. We can clear the alert and resume the release and dive preparations." Kirkpatrick did not answer immediately. He looked up. The sun was lowering, turning the sea into gold. He felt the surface again, wide and too honest, showing everything. Then he looked toward Life Raft 2. Breeze lay quiet beneath the canvas, and the sight of that small, still shape brought the earlier decision back to the front of his mind like a knife. The extra half hour had already eaten into the deadline. Breeze still did not have full strength. If they returned to procedure at once, the release would happen, and the ocean would finish what the oil had started. Kirkpatrick paused, weighing the same scales he had weighed all day. Risk, duty, discipline, humanity. Then he made a decision he could defend without lying. A decision that sounded like caution, because it was caution, and because caution was the only kind of kindness the war would tolerate. Harris, he said, even with confirmation, we hold silent running for a while longer and continue observation. This is a battlefield. Caution is never wasted. Harris froze for a fraction of a second. By standard procedure, once a threat was identified as non-hostile, they could safely return to task. The captain's choice clearly stretched the situation. Harris understood at once what Kirkpatrick was doing. He started to speak, then stopped. No one could argue against caution in a war zone. At last he nodded. "Understood, Captain. I'll keep us in silent observation." The order moved through the boat. The men heard it and understood its meaning without anyone saying it aloud. Tommy's face brightened, then tightened as he forced himself back into discipline. He glanced toward the raft and silently thought, "You lucky little thing." Graham, Peter, and others allowed themselves small, private smiles, the kind you could hide behind duty. No one exposed the kindness hidden inside the captain's logic. No one questioned it. They were men who faced death daily, trained to be rational and hard. Yet for this one fragile life, they were willing to accept a decision built on a misjudgment and keep the secret intact. The submarine held to silent running. Watches continued. Lookouts stayed on the horizon, but the atmosphere had changed. There was warmth now and expectation. Everyone waited, hoping that borrowed time would be enough for Breeze to regain strength. Kirkpatrick came onto the deck now and then and looked toward Life Raft 2. He kept his posture composed, his face unreadable, as if he were checking equipment. Yet inside, he felt something he had tried to bury for years, the need to believe that war did not own every inch of a man's conscience. He could not save everyone, he knew that, but he could refuse, in one small instance, to be made entirely into a machine. Night fell. The South Pacific turned black, dotted only by stars. Lights aboard were kept minimal, faint glows blinking across the deck. The boat rode the surface quietly, as if holding its breath. Breeze rested in the raft. Now and then it made a soft call, a sound that stood out clearly in the controlled darkness. It was not loud, not dangerous, but it was real, a reminder that life could persist even here. The extra 12 hours became a shared secret aboard the Arrowfish. They guarded it together, and with it they guarded the small life that had arrived by accident. In the night, the ocean was almost perfectly still. Waves slapped the hull in a regular, dull rhythm. After his night watch, Tommy did not go straight to rest. He moved lightly to Life Raft 2 and lifted the canvas just enough to check the bird. Under the moon, he could see Breeze curled on the soft cloth strips, breathing evenly, no longer gasping. He placed a small fresh fish near the bird, careful not to disturb it, and whispered without sound, as if speaking might break the spell. Graham used a quiet moment to check the feathers again. With steady attention and repeated wiping, most of the oil was gone. White down showed clearly under the moonlight. He touched Breeze's wing gently and felt a faint tremor of muscle beneath the feathers, a sign that strength was returning. The machinist had fixed engines and valves for years, and he recognized the difference between a failing system and one that was beginning slowly to answer. Below, Peter listened as always, tracking the sea's sounds. Yet he also kept one part of his awareness on the deck. When Breeze called softly, Peter's nerves loosened. In the deep silence of night, that sound was not merely an animal's voice. It became a thin strand connecting the crew to something warmer than war, something that did not ask them to kill or hide. Captain Kirkpatrick did not sleep. He returned again and again to the conning tower, checking the surrounding waters, and he checked on Breeze as well. He understood that his caution gave the bird time, but it also gave his men relief. War was a contest of machines, but it was also a contest of will. A moment like this, however small, could strengthen a crew for the patrols that still lay ahead. Time moved slowly. At last the horizon paled. The first light cut through the clouds and spread across the South Pacific, turning the sea a warm orange-red. The cold of night receded. The wind softened, and the surface looked for a brief moment like a promise. "Captain, look!" the lookout called, excitement breaking the morning's hush. Kirkpatrick stepped onto the deck and followed the lookout's pointing hand. Breeze was standing inside Life Raft 2. It no longer looked like a dying thing. It opened its wings. They were not yet perfectly stretched, but the span was unmistakable, nearly 2 meters from tip to tip. In the sunrise, the feathers looked clean and bright. Breeze beat its wings a few times and let out a clear call. The sound carried strength, and it carried something else too, a refusal to vanish. Men came up to the deck at once, drawn by hope becoming real. Tommy's face split into a wide smile that he did not try to hide. Graham nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. Even Harris, the guardian of procedure, let his shoulders drop a fraction, as if a weight had been lifted without permission. Kirkpatrick watched Breeze with a softened expression. He felt a brief, private shift inside him, like a valve opening. Then he closed it again and spoke in the tone that held the boat together. "All hands, assemble. We'll see off our temporary passenger." The crew formed up on the deck, standing in neat lines. No one talked. Every gaze stayed on Breeze. Sunlight climbed, flooding the deck and stretching long shadows behind each man. Kirkpatrick walked to the raft and gently pulled back the canvas cover. Breeze stepped forward and opened its wings again, then drove them downward with force. The motion was no longer weak. Each beat carried power and stirred the air, raising a faint wind across the deck. The bird lifted its head and looked toward the open sea and the sky beyond, eyes fixed on freedom. The deck fell silent again, but this silence was different. It held farewell and blessing. Tommy stared as if he might never see anything so pure again, and inside himself he formed a simple prayer: "Fly, go." Kirkpatrick did not add speeches. He did not need to. His men could read the meaning in his restraint. They had killed when ordered and held their breath when ordered. Now they stood still, offering the only gift the sea allowed: a clear path. After a brief moment, Breeze crouched, pushed hard off the raft's floor, and launched. Wings snapped open. The bird rose above the deck, circled once as if marking the faces below, and then flew straight toward the brightening horizon. White wings cut a clean arc through the orange light. The bird grew smaller, became a flicker, and then vanished into the sky. The men watched until there was nothing left to see. Then they let their eyes drop back to the deck. Smiles lingering. Relief settled deep. It had been a small thing, not recorded in any official report, not a victory that would appear on a map. Yet it became one of the warmest moments they would carry through the war, a memory that could be held without shame. Kirkpatrick stared at the empty sky for a second longer. He felt the surface again, too wide, too bright, and he felt the old vigilance return like a uniform pulled back on. He gave the next order with quiet certainty. "Clear the deck, all hands to stations, prepare to dive." "Understood," the crew answered together, their voices carrying renewed strength. They moved quickly, clearing away the improvised care setup, returning the deck to standard. The charging equipment came back online to finish the last of the replenishment. Then the hatch swung shut, sealing out the air and sunlight. The Arrowfish returned to the dark and confined world below, where every sound mattered and every breath tasted of metal. With the dive order given, the submarine slipped downward, sinking into the deep blue water until the surface closed over it and the boat disappeared into the South Pacific. The war resumed its familiar shape: silence, pressure, patience, and the possibility of sudden violence. Inside, the mechanical sounds resumed as the dominant rhythm. Men returned to their duties, focused and professional. No one spoke of breeze. The incident did not enter the boat's log, and no official record would carry it forward. But every man aboard remembered that morning in 1943 when they had protected a life that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. They remembered the feeling that war had not fully stripped them of gentleness. In guarding something weak, they were no longer only instruments of battle. They were men with blood and breath and a reverence for life that could survive even here. In the days ahead, they would again watch the horizon for aircraft and listen for screws in the deep. They would again measure decisions by risk and time. Yet somewhere under the weight of steel and duty, the image of white wings lifting into sunrise would remain. It would not change the war. It would change, in a small but stubborn way, how they endured it. Above them, the South Pacific returned to calm, as if nothing had happened. Yet the story of a submarine and a young albatross, a brief truce of warmth inside the cracks of war, remained with the crew of the Arrowfish. It became their private proof that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit's light could not be extinguished.